Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let us get back to our main character. Ethan Cross was a self-made millionaire. A man who had built his empire from nothing but grit, sleepless nights, and an iron-willed ambition that no one could tame. To the public, he was the perfect picture of success. Sharp jawline, tailored suits, and eyes that carried the weight of both victory and loneliness. Yet behind all that polish, Ethan was known among his inner circle for never backing down from a dare. To him, challenges were not obstacles. They were invitations to prove he could not be beaten. One night, inside a private lounge where crystal glasses clinked and laughter echoed like currency, a careless friend tossed out a reckless challenge. "Ethan," the man jeered with a drunken grin, "you can buy everything, but you would never dare to marry a woman who would actually defy you." The group erupted in bold laughter, but Ethan's eyes narrowed. He never walked away from a bet. He leaned back in his chair, lips curved into a half-smile. "Find me a woman wild enough to think she can rebel against me," he replied, "and I will marry her." The room went silent for a breath, then chaos followed. They knew he meant it. He always meant it. And that was the night fate began to stir. Across town, a young woman named Aria Blake was storming out of her college dorm. She was fiery, unpolished, and stubborn enough to fight anyone who tried to tell her how to live. Aria had been labeled a rebel since high school, skipping dances, questioning rules, standing up to authority. But beneath that storm of defiance lay a fragile truth no one cared to see. She had been fighting not the world, but the loneliness of having no one who truly believed in her. Their worlds collided in the most unexpected way. When Aria walked into that same lounge the following weekend, not as a guest but as a server filling in for a friend, Ethan's gaze locked onto her instantly. She did not bow her head. She did not soften her stance. She looked right back at him, as if to challenge the man who was used to owning every room he entered. For Ethan, it was not just attraction. It was the perfect storm. She was the embodiment of the dare. "Her," he said under his breath, his voice low enough for only his closest friend to hear. "She is the one." The wheels turned quickly after that. What began as a careless promise spun into a whirlwind of arrangements, whispered papers, and an impossible wedding that no one thought would actually happen. To the world, it looked like a sensational billionaire stunt. To Aria, it felt like being trapped inside a game she never signed up for. She fought it at every turn, questioning his motives, resisting the glittering cage he was so certain she would accept. Yet the ceremony came, cameras flashed, guests whispered, and there she was, a rebellious bride standing beside a man who treated marriage as if it were another mountain to conquer. But deep inside, Ethan felt a strange pull he had not expected. It was supposed to be a dare, a reckless display of pride. Yet when Aria's hand trembled in his, something in his chest shifted. He ignored it that day, burying it under his usual confidence. He had won the bet, after all. The rebel was now his wife. What Ethan did not know was that the real story, the one that would shatter his iron pride, had not yet begun. It would reveal itself only when the doors closed, when the cameras disappeared, and when the world outside faded into silence. Because on that first night, he was about to discover a truth that would turn his game into something far deeper than a dare. The wedding between Ethan Cross and Aria Blake had ended with flashing cameras, polite applause, and whispers that followed them out of the chapel doors. To the outside world, it was the kind of spectacle that only a billionaire could create. A marriage born out of audacity, wrapped in silk gowns and tailored tuxedos, with every headline screaming about the rebel girl who dared to become the bride of a self-made empire builder. But once the lights dimmed and the crowd dispersed, reality settled in. The limousine carried them away from the noise, and the silence inside was almost unbearable. Aria sat stiffly in her white gown, staring out the tinted window at the blur of city lights. She did not look like a bride glowing with happiness. She looked like a fighter who had been forced into a corner. Her jaw was set, her fists tight in her lap, and her eyes reflected the battle she refused to lose. Ethan, on the other hand, leaned back against the leather seat with a cool expression. To him, the wedding had been a performance well executed, a dare completed. He glanced at Aria, noting her rigid posture, and smirked faintly. "You carry yourself like you are preparing for war," he said, his voice even and calm. "Relax, the ceremony is over." Aria turned her head slowly, her dark eyes burning with defiance. "Do not mistake my silence for surrender," she answered. "You may have won your game, but I will never be one of your trophies." The words cut sharper than she realized. For the first time in years, Ethan felt a flicker of something other than control. He studied her carefully, realizing that this was not the kind of woman who bowed her head for wealth or status. This was someone who would challenge him at every step, someone who might even expose the emptiness behind the dares he lived for. When they arrived at his penthouse, the tension only grew. The elevator doors opened to reveal glass walls framing the city skyline, chandeliers glittering above, and furniture that seemed untouched by time. It was the world Ethan had built with discipline and precision. Yet Aria stepped inside as if she had been thrown into a foreign land. "This is not a home," she said under her breath, scanning the pristine space. "It is a museum." Ethan raised a brow. "It is where I live." "No," she replied firmly, her voice echoing through the marble floors. "It is where you keep yourself caged." For a moment, Ethan had no reply. He was not used to anyone dissecting his life so openly, especially not a woman who had only just entered it. He could command boardrooms, silence competitors, and close deals worth millions with a single nod. Yet this rebel girl stood there, unafraid to strip down the image he had built like armor. Hours passed, and the night drew closer. Their first evening, as husband and wife, unfolded not with romance, but with sharp exchanges and the constant crackle of unspoken tension. Aria changed out of her gown into a simple dress, her movements brisk, her chin high, as if daring him to expect anything more. Ethan poured himself a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the city lights, and studied her from across the room. He should have felt victorious. He had accepted the dare and had seen it through. Yet watching Aria pace the floor, restless and unyielding, he could not shake the sense that he was the one being tested. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but firm. "You think this marriage is just a game to me. You think I will treat you like a possession. But you will learn, Aria, that I never lose." Aria stopped and turned, her eyes locking onto his with a fire that made his chest tighten. "And you will learn," she said, her tone steady, "that not everything worth keeping can be bought or won." The air between them thickened, heavy with challenge, and something far more dangerous. Neither of them knew it yet, but this was the beginning of a war neither side was prepared for. A war that would unravel secrets and ignite feelings that no dare could have predicted. And as the city outside pulsed with endless life, inside Ethan's penthouse, the stage was set for the first real clash between the billionaire who never lost and the rebel girl who refused to break. The morning after their wedding carried none of the sweetness that newlyweds were supposed to share. Instead, the penthouse was filled with a quiet tension that pressed against the glass walls as heavily as the gray clouds outside. Ethan Cross was already awake, dressed in his usual crisp shirt and slacks, seated at the long dining table with a cup of black coffee steaming in front of him. His phone buzzed with messages from business partners and investors, but his eyes were drawn repeatedly toward the closed bedroom door at the end of the hall. Aria Blake had not stepped out since the night before. The silence from her side of the penthouse was deafening, a reminder that she was not a willing bride but a woman forced into a role by circumstances that spiraled out of her control. When she finally emerged, she was barefoot, her hair pulled into a messy knot, and wearing a plain shirt paired with faded jeans she had borrowed from her small overnight bag. She looked nothing like the glamorous bride from yesterday's headlines. Ethan's gaze followed her as she crossed the room and poured herself a glass of water without a word. She moved with deliberate calm, but the defiance in her posture had not faded. She was not trying to impress him. She was not even trying to please him. She was simply existing on her own terms, and that alone unsettled him. "Good morning, Mrs. Cross," Ethan said finally, his tone even but edged with provocation. Aria lifted the glass to her lips, took a slow sip, and then met his gaze with unshaken eyes. "Do not call me that," she replied. "That name may be on paper, but it is not who I am." Ethan smirked faintly. "Names are not just paper, Aria. They carry weight. They open doors. They shape futures. You are in my world now, and you should learn to use the power it offers." Her laugh was sharp, almost bitter. "Power that comes from standing in someone else's shadow is not power at all. I will not live, as an accessory to your empire." The words cut into the air, and Ethan found himself leaning back in his chair, studying her with sharper focus. Most people bowed when confronted with his authority. They softened their tone, lowered their gaze, and sought his approval. Aria did the opposite. Every word she spoke pushed against him, testing the edges of the walls he had built around his life. Later that day, the tension followed them as they attended a luncheon arranged by Ethan's business associates. The room was filled with polished executives and their polished partners, each couple seated around an endless table of crystal glasses and fine silverware. Aria entered beside Ethan, her shoulders squared, her eyes steady. She had no designer gown, no flawless jewelry, only her natural presence that seemed to draw just as much attention as the diamonds glittering on the others. Whispers rippled through the room as they sat down. The rebel bride, the girl who had said no to privilege, now bound to the man who owned more than most nations could dream of. Ethan felt the weight of their stares, but he kept his expression unreadable. When one of the wives leaned forward and asked Aria how it felt to marry into such fortune, Aria answered without hesitation. "It feels exactly the same as waking up yesterday," she said. "Money does not change who I am." The table fell into stunned silence before polite laughter rippled awkwardly through the group. Ethan's jaw tightened. He should have been angry at her bluntness, at the way she disrupted the performance that his world required. Yet a part of him, one he would never admit, felt an unfamiliar spark of admiration. Back at the penthouse, the storm between them reignited. Ethan confronted her with quiet intensity. "You embarrassed me today," he said. "No," Aria countered. "I embarrassed your illusion. I will not pretend for you, Ethan. I will not bend myself into a shape that fits the picture you want to paint for your world." The words struck him harder than he cared to show. For a man who thrived on control, the realization that he could not control her was more dangerous than any financial risk. As the evening fell, Ethan stood by the glass window staring at the city he owned piece by piece. Behind him, Aria curled on the couch with a book she had pulled from her small bag, her presence quiet but unyielding. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was alive, charged with a tension that neither dared to name. And as the lights of the city burned below, Ethan Cross began to sense that this marriage born from a dare was no longer a simple game. It was the beginning of something that threatened to unravel the man he believed himself to be. Days turned into weeks, and the arrangement that began as a reckless dare continued to unfold under the same roof. Ethan Cross was used to commanding his world with flawless precision, but sharing space with Aria Blake was unlike any business negotiation he had ever managed. She was unpredictable, stubborn, and constantly challenging his authority in small ways that unsettled his carefully ordered life. In the mornings, Ethan expected silence and discipline. Instead, he found Aria in the kitchen humming softly while scrambling eggs, barefoot and entirely unbothered by the pristine marble counters that gleamed under the sunlight. When he reminded her that the staff could handle breakfast, she simply shrugged. "I like to cook," she said. "It makes me feel real in a place that feels manufactured." Her words stung more than he admitted. Ethan's penthouse was a symbol of power, a fortress built from his success. Yet in her eyes, it was nothing but cold glass and steel. Still, he let her cook. He told himself it was because it saved time. But deep down, he knew it was because he was beginning to crave the sound of her voice in the morning, the scent of something warm filling the air that no chef could ever recreate. Their days together were laced with conflict and reluctant fascination. Aria explored the city on her own, often leaving Ethan's security detail frustrated by her sudden disappearances. She would return hours later with paint on her fingers from an art studio or books stacked in her arms from a local shop. When Ethan confronted her about the risk, she stood tall and answered, "I will not live like a prisoner just because you are afraid of losing control." Her defiance both infuriated and intrigued him. He was a man accustomed to people who followed his lead without question. Aria, however, was rewriting every rule. The turning point came one evening during a gala hosted by one of Ethan's partners. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers, and the air hummed with polite laughter and practiced charm. Aria arrived at his side wearing a simple black dress. Nothing extravagant, yet she stole every eye in the room with her natural poise. Ethan introduced her as his wife, but she refused to play the part of a silent ornament. When a guest commented on her background with a subtle sneer, Aria replied with sharp wit that left the table stunned into silence. Later that night, as they returned to the penthouse, Ethan finally voiced what had been building inside him. "You do not know when to hold your tongue," he said. his tone sharper than usual. Aria met his gaze, unwavering. "And you do not know when to speak the truth," she answered. "You think the world respects you because of your wealth. But real respect cannot be bought." The exchange left him restless. For the first time, he questioned whether the dare had led him to something far greater than he anticipated. He had sought a challenge for his pride, but what he received was a mirror that reflected the emptiness he had been avoiding. That night, Ethan stood by the window as he often did, staring at the endless sprawl of city lights. Behind him, Aria moved quietly through the apartment, her presence like a storm he could not escape. She was not trying to change him, yet every word, every action, was forcing him to confront parts of himself he had buried long ago. As the clock neared midnight, Aria walked past him, her eyes briefly meeting his. For a moment, there was no defiance, only something softer, something he could not quite name. It vanished as quickly as it appeared, but it lingered in his thoughts long after she disappeared into the bedroom. Ethan Cross, the man who had built his empire on control, was losing his grip. Not to failure, not to competition, but to a rebel girl who had walked into his life because of a dare. And as he poured himself another glass of whiskey, he knew that what lay ahead was no longer just a game. It was a battle between pride and vulnerability, one that would change both of them in ways neither was ready to admit. The weeks stretched on, and what began as a union forged by pride and recklessness was slowly becoming a battlefield of emotions neither Ethan Cross nor Aria Blake had prepared to face. Each day inside the penthouse seemed to peel back another layer of the fragile arrangement. Ethan had thought Aria would eventually bend, that she would grow tired of resisting the power and luxury surrounding her. But Aria only grew stronger in her defiance, and with each act of rebellion, Ethan found himself torn between frustration and fascination. One evening, Ethan returned late from a meeting, his mind clouded with contracts and numbers. He expected to find Aria asleep or withdrawn, as she often was after their tense exchanges. Instead, he walked into the living room and froze. Aria was sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by brushes, open paint jars, and a half-finished canvas propped against the coffee table. The bright strokes of color were wild, raw, and alive, in a way that his immaculate penthouse had never been. She did not look up at first, but when she sensed his presence, her eyes lifted to meet his. There was no apology in them, no guilt for staining the marble floor with paint. "I needed space to breathe," she said quietly. Ethan studied the painting. It was not polished or controlled, but it was undeniably powerful. For a man who lived in a world of precision and order, the chaotic beauty before him stirred something unfamiliar. "You could have used the studio downstairs," he said, though his voice lacked its usual bite. "I did not want a sterile room," she replied. "I wanted this space to feel like someone actually lived here." Her words struck him deeper than he cared to admit. For years, his penthouse had been more a monument than a home. It had been filled with silence, with the hollow echoes of success, and he had never noticed until now. The days that followed revealed more pieces of Aria he had not expected. She spent afternoons at small bookstores, evenings, sketching in the quiet corners of the penthouse, and sometimes long hours just staring out the window at the city lights. She carried a loneliness in her that mirrored his own, though she disguised it behind her sharp tongue and rebellious spirit. One night, as rain pounded against the glass walls, their simmering conflict erupted again. Ethan had offered to assign her a driver and security detail to accompany her around the city. Aria refused, insisting she would not be treated like a fragile possession. The argument grew heated, voices raised against the storm outside, until finally she shouted, "You think this is about control, Ethan, but it is not. It is about trust. And you do not trust me enough to let me live my own life." The accusation cut through him. Ethan had always prided himself on control, but Aria's words forced him to see it for what it was. Fear. Fear of losing, fear of weakness, fear of allowing someone too close. Later that night, the storm quieted, and the silence between them was heavier than ever. Ethan poured himself a drink and sat across from Aria at the dining table. She looked exhausted, her defiance dimmed but not extinguished. For the first time, he did not see her as a dare or a rebellion to conquer. He saw her as a woman standing in front of him, unafraid to challenge his very core. "Aria," he said slowly, his voice softer than before, "I have spent my life proving that I cannot be defeated. But with you, I am not sure what winning even means anymore." Her eyes widened slightly, but she did not reply. Instead, she looked away. her fingers tracing the rim of her glass. The moment hung between them, fragile and unspoken, but powerful enough to shift the ground they stood on. That night, as they both retreated into silence, Ethan realized that the marriage born out of a dare was no longer about pride or control. It was about survival of trust, of vulnerability, and of a growing connection that neither of them was ready to name. And deep within, he began to fear that this rebel girl might be the one battle he could not afford to lose. The rain had cleared by morning, leaving the city wrapped in a pale gray mist. Inside the penthouse, Ethan Cross stood by the window, staring at the skyline with a restless intensity. Sleep had not come easily to him. Aria Blake's words from the night before still echoed in his mind, sharp and undeniable. It is about trust. For a man who had built his empire by never trusting anyone fully, the challenge struck deeper than any business risk he had ever taken. When Aria entered the room, she was wearing a simple sweater and jeans, her hair pulled back carelessly, her eyes tired but steady. She walked past him toward the kitchen without a word, pouring herself coffee as though the argument had not left cracks in both of them. Ethan turned, watching her with an expression that betrayed none of the storm inside him. "You are quiet today," he said finally. "I said everything I needed to say last night," Aria replied. Her tone was calm, but her words carried the weight of finality. For the rest of the morning, they moved around each other like two forces circling a battlefield, neither willing to take the first step toward surrender. Ethan returned to his phone calls and meetings, his voice commanding over the line, while Aria retreated into her art, her hands covered in streaks of paint as she worked on a canvas in the living room. The contrast was stark. His world of numbers and contracts, her world of color and expression. But the tension between them refused to fade. That evening, Ethan found her sitting on the balcony, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the glow of the city below. He stepped outside, the cool air brushing against them both, and stood beside her. "You make this place feel different," he said at last. Aria turned her head, surprised at the admission. "Different? How?" "Less like a cage," he answered. For a moment, her defiance softened. She studied him with a quiet intensity, as though trying to decide if his words were genuine. "I did not come here to change you, Ethan," she said softly. "But I also will not lose myself to prove I belong in your world." Her honesty disarmed him. He had expected another battle, another sharp retort, but instead she had given him truth. It was a truth that stirred something unfamiliar, something he could not silence. Later that night, the fragile wall between them cracked further. As they prepared to retire, Ethan reached for the book she had left on the coffee table. It was worn, its pages marked with notes in her handwriting. "You read this often," he said. "It reminds me that stories can change people," she replied. Ethan looked at her, really looked, and realized how little he knew about the woman who now shared his name. She was not just a rebel defying his control. She was a survivor, a dreamer, someone who had been forced to fight for her place in the world. And in that moment, the truth he had ignored since the night of the dare became undeniable. She was not the prize of a game, but the heart of a story he had never expected to live. The hours stretched into silence, but it was no longer the hostile quiet of before. It was charged with something neither of them could name, an invisible thread pulling them closer even as pride kept them apart. Ethan lay awake long after the city had fallen asleep, the realization pressing on him with relentless weight. He had once believed he could walk away from this marriage unchanged, that it would remain nothing more than a dare completed. But now, as he replayed every word, every glance, every spark of defiance in Aria's eyes, Ethan knew he was standing on the edge of something far more dangerous. For the first time in his life, the man who never lost began to understand that this battle was not about victory. It was about surrender not to weakness, but to a woman who had turned his world upside down with nothing more than her truth. The following week arrived with a shift neither Ethan Cross nor Aria Blake could fully explain. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first. But it was there in the way their arguments no longer erupted as often. In the way their silences began to feel less like walls and more like space to breathe. Ethan had a string of late-night meetings, but he noticed that when he returned to the penthouse, Aria was no longer locked away in her room. She was present. Sometimes she was sketching on the balcony, other times reading by the glow of a lamp. And though she rarely acknowledged him outright, her quiet presence carried an unexpected comfort. One evening, when Ethan entered, he found her in the kitchen attempting to cook. The air smelled of garlic and herbs, though the stovetop was a mess, and her expression was one of mild frustration. She turned sharply at the sound of his footsteps. "Do not laugh," she warned. Ethan raised his hands in mock surrender, but a smirk tugged at his lips. "I was only going to ask if the fire department should be on standby." Her eyes narrowed. But then, for the first time since their marriage began, Aria laughed. It was genuine, soft, and entirely disarming. Ethan stood frozen, his chest tightening with a sensation he had not felt in years. Her laughter did not feel like rebellion. It felt like light breaking through a storm. Without thinking, he stepped closer and offered, "Let me help." Together, they finished preparing the meal. It was far from perfect, but when they sat down at the dining table, sharing food made by their own hands, the atmosphere shifted. It was not businesslike, nor was it combative. It was human. Ethan watched her as she ate, the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the way her eyes lit up when she spoke about colors and canvases. He realized he was listening not as a husband bound by a contract, but as a man curious about the woman across from him. Later that night, Aria leaned against the glass wall of the living room, gazing at the glittering skyline. Ethan joined her, both of them quiet for a long time. Then she said softly, "Sometimes I wonder how two people as different as us ended up here." Ethan did not answer immediately. His instinct was to dismiss the question, to cloak himself in arrogance and say it was all a game. But he could not. Not anymore. "Maybe because we are not as different as we think," he replied at last. She turned her head, studying him, searching for the truth in his words. And in that silence, Ethan felt exposed in a way he had never allowed himself to be. The days that followed carried the echo of that moment. Their interactions became gentler, their walls thinner. Aria still challenged him, and Ethan still struggled with the instinct to control. But beneath it all grew an undercurrent of something neither of them wanted to name. One night, as the city hummed below, Ethan caught himself watching Aria while she painted. Her brow furrowed in concentration, her hands steady, her expression fierce yet vulnerable. He realized then that his world, so carefully constructed from wealth and power, felt incomplete without her presence. But as quickly as the thought surfaced, so too did the fear. For Ethan Cross, surrendering meant risk. And risk, in his world, had always been calculated, never emotional. Yet with Aria, calculation failed him. What he did not know was that Aria too was wrestling with her own fears. She had built her life on independence, on never letting anyone dictate her choices. And now here she was, beginning to feel drawn toward the very man she had sworn she would never give her heart to. Both of them stood at the edge of something vast and dangerous, neither willing to admit aloud what was becoming obvious. The dare had faded, the contract had blurred, and something real was beginning to take its place. The following days seemed to weave a fragile thread of connection between Ethan Cross and Aria Blake, though neither of them dared to acknowledge it aloud. Their arrangement had started as a spectacle, a reckless decision born of pride and challenge. Yet now it had taken on a rhythm that neither expected. The battles were still there, but softer now, as if both had grown tired of fighting against something that was already shifting inside them. One afternoon, Ethan returned earlier than usual from his office. He found Aria in the sunlit corner of the penthouse, kneeling before a large canvas. Her hands were covered in streaks of deep blue and crimson, her face illuminated by determination. She did not notice him at first, and Ethan stood quietly, watching her in a way that unsettled him. For the first time, he was not analyzing or strategizing. He was simply observing, struck by the raw beauty of her focus. When she finally looked up and caught him staring, a flicker of unease crossed her face. "You are home early," she said, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "I wanted to be," Ethan answered without hesitation. The simplicity of his response startled them both. They spent that evening in unexpected companionship. Aria spoke about her art, about how every color carried emotion, and Ethan found himself listening with genuine curiosity. In turn, he revealed fragments of his past, stories he rarely shared with anyone. He spoke of how his father had taught him that weakness was unforgivable, how every deal, every victory, was meant to prove his worth. Aria listened, her eyes soft but unwavering, as if she understood the burden of carrying expectations too heavy for one person. Later, as the city outside shimmered beneath the night sky, Aria leaned against the glass wall, her voice quiet but firm. "Ethan, do you ever wonder what it would feel like to live without all this pressure? Without the constant need to win?" The question struck him. He had built his entire existence on victory, on power, on never yielding. But when he looked at her, he realized the truth he had never admitted even to himself. "I wonder every day," he confessed. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the air between them felt charged with something unspoken, something fragile, yet undeniable. Neither moved, but both felt the shift. That night, Aria did not retreat to her room. Instead, she lingered in the living room, sketching idly while Ethan worked nearby. There was no conversation, only the quiet sound of pencil on paper and the faint tapping of keys. Yet the silence felt different now, no longer a barrier, but a shared space. As the hours stretched on, Ethan found himself glancing at her more often than at the documents before him. She was a contradiction he could not resolve. Rebellious, yet vulnerable. Defiant, yet compassionate. And the realization that he was beginning to need her unsettled him more than any business rival ever had. In her own quiet way, Aria felt the change as well. She had entered this marriage determined to remain untouched, to guard her heart from a man who represented everything she resented. But now, she saw glimpses of someone else beneath the armor. A man who carried scars, who longed for something beyond wealth and conquest. Neither spoke of it, but both knew the truth. The dare that had once defined their union was slipping away. What remained was something far more dangerous. The possibility of real feelings, unguarded and raw. As the night faded into dawn, Ethan closed his laptop and leaned back, his eyes lingering on Aria as she slept curled on the couch, her sketchbook resting against her chest. A softness touched his expression, rare and unguarded. He knew then that this was no longer a game he could control. For Ethan Cross, the man who never allowed vulnerability, and Aria Blake, the woman who vowed never to surrender her heart, the lines between defiance and desire had begun to blur, and neither of them was ready for what would come next. The following days seemed to weave a fragile thread of connection between Ethan Cross and Aria Blake, though neither of them dared to acknowledge it aloud. Their arrangement had started as a spectacle, a reckless decision born of pride and challenge, yet now it had taken on a rhythm that neither expected. The battles were still there, but softer now, as if both had grown tired of fighting against something that was already shifting inside them. One afternoon, Ethan returned earlier than usual from his office. He found Aria in the sunlit corner of the penthouse, kneeling before a large canvas. Her hands were covered in streaks of deep blue and crimson, her face illuminated by determination. She did not notice him at first, and Ethan stood quietly, watching her in a way that unsettled him. For the first time, he was not analyzing or strategizing. He was simply observing, struck by the raw beauty of her focus. When she finally looked up and caught him staring, a flicker of unease crossed her face. "You are home early," she said, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "I wanted to be," Ethan answered without hesitation. The simplicity of his response startled them both. They spent that evening in unexpected companionship. Aria spoke about her art, about how every color carried emotion, and Ethan found himself listening with genuine curiosity. In turn, he revealed fragments of his past, stories he rarely shared with anyone. He spoke of how his father had taught him that weakness was unforgivable, how every deal, every victory, was meant to prove his worth. Aria listened, her eyes soft but unwavering, as if she understood the burden of carrying expectations too heavy for one person. Later, as the city outside shimmered beneath the night sky, Aria leaned against the glass wall, her voice quiet but firm. "Ethan, do you ever wonder what it would feel like to live without all this pressure? Without the constant need to win?" The question struck him. He had built his entire existence on victory, on power, on never yielding. But when he looked at her, he realized the truth he had never admitted even to himself. "I wonder every day," he confessed. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the air between them felt charged with something unspoken, something fragile yet undeniable. Neither moved, but both felt the shift. That night, Aria did not retreat to her room. Instead, she lingered in the living room, sketching idly while Ethan worked nearby. There was no conversation, only the quiet sound of pencil on paper and the faint tapping of keys. Yet the silence felt different now, no longer a barrier, but a shared space. As the hours stretched on, Ethan found himself glancing at her more often than at the documents before him. She was a contradiction he could not resolve. Rebellious, yet vulnerable, defiant, yet compassionate. And the realization that he was beginning to need her unsettled him more than any business rival ever had. In her own quiet way, Aria felt the change as well. She had entered this marriage determined to remain untouched, to guard her heart from a man who represented everything she resented. But now, she saw glimpses of someone else beneath the armor, a man who carried scars, who longed for something beyond wealth and conquest. Neither spoke of it, but both knew the truth. The dare that had once defined their union was slipping away. What remained was something far more dangerous, the possibility of real feelings, unguarded and raw. As the night faded into dawn, Ethan closed his laptop and leaned back, his eyes lingering on Aria as she slept curled on the couch, her sketchbook resting against her chest. A softness touched his expression, rare and unguarded. He knew then that this was no longer a game he could control. For Ethan Cross, the man who never allowed vulnerability, and Aria Blake, the woman who vowed never to surrender her heart, the lines between defiance and desire had begun to blur, and neither of them was ready for what would come next. The final weeks of their contract arrived faster than either Ethan Cross or Aria Blake had anticipated. What began as a reckless dare had turned into something far more complicated, something neither of them could easily escape. The penthouse, once cold and sterile, now carried traces of their shared presence. Canvases leaning against the walls, half-read books on the coffee table, and quiet evenings, where silence no longer felt hostile, but intimate. Ethan had spent his life believing that control defined him. Yet every moment with Aria had chipped away at that belief. He no longer looked at her as a challenge to conquer, but as a woman whose strength had forced him to confront parts of himself he had buried. One evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline and painted the city in gold and crimson, Ethan entered the living room to find Aria packing a small suitcase. His chest tightened at the sight. He had known the end was coming, yet seeing it unfold before his eyes left him unsteady in a way he had never known. "You are leaving," he said quietly. Aria paused, her hand resting on the suitcase. "The agreement is almost over, Ethan. You and I both knew this was temporary." Her words were calm, but her eyes betrayed the storm inside her. Ethan stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "Do you truly want to walk away?" She looked at him, the defiance still there but softened by something deeper. "What do you expect me to say? That I want to stay, even though this began as nothing but a game to you?" The truth cut him, but for the first time in his life, Ethan did not hide behind pride. He reached for her hand, holding it with a gentleness that surprised even him. "It began as a game, yes, but it is no longer that for me. You have changed everything, Aria. You made me see a life beyond power and numbers. You made me see myself." Tears shimmered in her eyes, though she tried to blink them away. "And what if I say I am afraid, Ethan? Afraid that if I give you my heart, you will break it?" He tightened his hold, his gaze unwavering. "Then I will spend every day proving that I will not." The silence between them was heavy, but it was no longer filled with distance. It was filled with choice. Aria searched his face, looking for doubt, for hesitation, but found only sincerity. Slowly, she released the suitcase handle and let it fall closed. That night, for the first time, there were no battles, no sharp words, no walls. Instead, there was surrender, not of defeat, but of fear. Aria allowed herself to lean into the man she once swore she would never trust, and Ethan allowed himself to embrace the one woman who had broken through his carefully constructed armor. The dare that had bound them together had ended, but in its place stood something far stronger. It was not about pride, not about winning, not about control. It was about two hearts finding each other in the most unexpected of ways. As the city lights flickered outside and dawn approached, Ethan and Aria both understood that their story was no longer about a reckless game. It was about love, raw, fragile, and real. And this time, neither of them was willing to let it go.